what happened to those spacesuits? What happened to those X-ray TV glasses? Where is my damn jetpack? So I decided to do a little research. As it turns out, there are a few reasons why we didn't develop a jetpack infrastructure. Awesome that might be. The first is that even minor fender benders in the world of jetpacks can be catastrophic. The second is that jetpacks, you have to carry all the fuel that you're going to expel. And they still haven't quite figured out how to make a flight last for more than a few seconds. But lastly, and most importantly, I think, is that jetpacks are incredibly unsustainable. A jetpack makes a Hummer look like a Prius. Maybe, just maybe, in this time in which I'm hearing a lot of pessimism, maybe knowingly or unknowingly, we did the right thing. We've known how to make these jetpacks since the 1960s, but maybe we didn't shift everything. Now, this fellow who spoke at lunch spoke a lot about freedom. And one of the reasons why cars continually get overfunded compared to public transportation is that there's an argument being made that Americans love freedom. They love to come and go when they want to go, and this is writ somehow in our national character. Well, I would argue that freedom is not so free when you're stuck in traffic, and freedom is not so free when you're beholden to a dying fuel source, and freedom is not so free when that fuel source costs $5 or $6 a gallon. And if freedom is truly the argument, wouldn't jetpacks be much better than cars anyway? You don't even need roads. But free as cars made us feel on the open road, they also tore our communities apart. They drained our cities and encouraged us to live farther and farther away from one another. And I think helped erode some of the very unquantifiable things that we have learned about human community on a human scale over millennia. And I think jetpacks, sadly, might be even worse. All over the country, young people are moving back to cities, not just in New York and San Francisco, but in Milwaukee, in Paducah, in Detroit. And many of those places are putting back things like light rail and trolleys that they tore up decades ago, because those kinds of transportation have ways of concentrating development, of building community, of putting us all in the same place. I'm afraid jetpacks might do the opposite. So therefore, I am reluctantly deciding not to recommend that Olney Friends School focus on jetpack education and infrastructure in the next century. You already have here what so many cities and institutions are struggling to get back, a deep sense of community on a human scale. And that level of community provides a kind of resilience that we are all going to need to re-find as a nation. Sadly, I do not recommend that neither your agricultural efforts nor your kitchen focus on processed stick food rods like the ones I was so taken by as a kid. I think the goo path our nation has traveled needs to be rebalanced with the kind of agriculture and food systems that you are developing and practicing right here. So many of the sentiments echoed in this summit reflect values celebrated and practiced here already at Olney, an emphasis on sustainability, on community, on the local. I believe that these are all the most essential tenets of the economy we need to create in America in the 21st century. Localized food systems, as we've heard from so many speakers here, promote foods that keep dollars circulating in the communities, provide safer, fresher foods to our communities and schools, don't need to make shelf life the primary attribute. In the 21st century food economy, we won't subsidize goo. But how about if we reward farmers for growing fresh food? How about if we reward them for rotating grasses that sequester carbon? We will also need local energy and manufacturing as well. In a diminishing resource world, as so many have pointed out here, the model of bringing everything from distant quarters cannot be sustained. But by promoting local economies, we can everywhere reduce the kinds of disparities and preconditions that have given rise to the explosion in modern slavery. Local economies in places like Moldova will help prevent those disparities. With re-emphasis on making things at home, we will be able to focus on places like Detroit. I believe, and this is something that also came out of listening to Bob at lunch today, I think that one thing he got absolutely right is that we do need to make things in this country. I think he was absolutely right that we need to emerge from our schools with the ability and knowledge, not just in philosophy, as valuable as that is, but of how to manufacture things. You know that in the last 30 years, we have created and lived this illusion in America that we can somehow have an economy without making anything. And it has really been to our detriment. When we shipped those jobs away, abroad because cheap fuel and cheap labor over there made it seem so appealing, how short-sighted was that? We never even realized that we were shipping away the place of innovation. We were shipping away the place where some next generation Henry Ford on some assembly line is going to say, I know how to do this better. The other thing that I really am struck by is this notion, this kind of manufacturing and making heritage. Every year we have less and less people who know how to be machinists. We have less and less people who know how to be tool and die people. In this diminishing resource economy that we're moving into, we are going to need to make things at home. The algorithm simply will not work out. There's two major trends. In the developing world, those formerly cheap laborers are going to become more aware of where they are, who they are, what their rights are, and they are going to demand more pay. In addition to, we hope, more of a say in their lives. But as petroleum diminishes, that's the other thing. It's simply not going to make sense to bring toasters from Indonesia. But I think one of the things that really was a little sad about the lunchtime address today is that this is exactly the kind of thing that Olney has been celebrating. So you have all these speakers coming up here saying, you know, we need to create students that know how to do things in the world. Well, this is my third visit here. My first visit here, it was immediately apparent that those were values that Olney celebrated. It was immediately apparent that Olney celebrated so many of the things we're all saying here. Create local economies, provide, you know, vocational training as well as educational training. And that's why this summit, on some level, makes me feel like I'm having to say something that I don't ordinarily say. I go around the country, as Abby said, most recently on a Rockefeller grant, talking about how we need to think long-term, talking about how we need to focus on the sustainable. But that's something you guys have been doing for a long time. So where does that leave us with this summit? You know, you are the example, and you should continue to be the example. But as Abby pointed out, you can't have long-term without having short-term as well. These things have to live in balance. So what is the short-term need? This is a unique institution that does think long-term, what we all need to do as a nation. But what do you need to do in the short term? Well, I think the most important thing you need to do is to communicate what you are, who you are, how you've been doing it. And all I can say is that a filmmaker who you've seen a little of my work, maybe you could consider that as my audition, because I would love to try to be helpful with that going forward. I'd love to come back and try to talk about at least making messages that get out there, because I believe if the world could see what I saw here, they would be heartened, and you would be an example for all of us. Thank you so much for having me. Cool. So how does this work?
Okay. Yes, David. Yes. So we have about 15 minutes for questions for Aaron. Lights, please. First question. Do you think that Dick Tracy had it right? It wasn't to be a jetpack, but a wrist radio, aka a smartphone.
I actually would like to answer that question seriously. One of the many enlightening things that I saw and heard here was David Klein yesterday talking about technology. And it's pretty amazing to see an Amish farmer say that technology is not such a bad thing. We don't want to be its, how did he phrase it, Abby? It was so eloquent. We don't want to be its servant. It makes a terrific servant, but a terrible master. And that notion of balance, to me, is what we really need to find. And I think that my iPhone has made me a more productive person. I think it's enabled me to get messages out to the world, to organize my thoughts in a way that has helped me entirely. But that iPhone has also made me not able to sleep, made me not able to stop working, which is incredibly essential too. So I would like to have seen in those Dick Tracy cartoons at night when he takes his wrist radio off and puts it into a safe locked box and goes out and chops some wood, because that to me is just as important as doing stuff on my phone.
All right, next question. Could you make the connection between corn subsidies and undocumented immigrants more explicit?
The answer is I think I might be able to, and an even better answer is that I should. You know, from a filmmaking standpoint, I thought documentary is tough. You don't often have a script. You go to a place. You can't go to a place without some idea of what you're trying to do, but you have to be open to whatever it is that happens before you. It's very hard to find structure when you make documentary films. But I thought when we went to Iowa with my cousin and his buddy, this was going to be a drop-dead cinch. We had 1 acre, we had 1 growing season. This is the kind of structure that documentary filmmakers yearn for. And yet, there were so many stories. It wasn't just the story of food. It was the story of the environment. And some of you have seen the sequel to King Corn called Big River, which looks at the environmental impact of that acre. But it also was an immigration story. And those corn subsidies that made corn so cheap, in fact, so cheap in the United States that corn is and was and still is cheaper in the marketplace than the cost to produce it. That artifice did all sorts of things in cultures that have depended on growing corn for millennia. In Latin America, for example, that cheap corn flooded the market and knocked people off of family farms, knocked away a kind of local heritage in which different hybrids, different selected seeds of corn that were just specific to certain microclimates suddenly could no longer compete with this kind of, we only have 6 strains, 70% of the corn grown in America is from 6 genetic strains. And southern Mexico and central Mexico are repositories of thousands of strains. So that cheap corn knocked those farmers off the land, and not having work, what did they do? They ended up in things like smuggling operations, being smuggled, sometimes being trafficked, sometimes migrating legally, but coming to work in slaughterhouses in unsafe conditions, which were supported by those same piles of corn. So there is a connection. Somebody should probably make a film about that, but sadly, I think it's not going to be me.
Okay, this is kind of like a follow-up question also about immigrants. How do we effectively address anti-immigration sentiment to change federal law to allow for safe, regularized labor migration and study work exchange programs?
Demagoguery about anti-immigrant demagoguery is not unique to the United States. It is really picking up steam all across the world right now, and it's not unique to this particular time. It is always